Imagine you're floating thousands of miles above Earth, looking down at that beautiful blue planet we all call home. Everything feels calm, quiet, and almost magical. And then, suddenly, alarms start blaring. Lights are flashing, and your oxygen tank is leaking. In that moment, you realize something terrifying. There's no hospital nearby, no fire department, no emergency exit. It's just you, your crewmates, and the endless vacuum of space. Scary, right? That's the reality astronauts face. And today, we're diving deep into some of the scariest, most heart-stopping moments astronauts have ever experienced out there. These are the stories they don't put in the glossy brochures. The moments when everything almost went horribly wrong. Now, before we dive into the chaos, let me ask you something. Have you ever been in a situation where you suddenly realized just how fragile you are? Like when you're swimming, and for one split second, you go under longer than you planned, and panic sets in. Or maybe you've been in a car, and you slam on the brakes just in time to avoid a crash, and your heart is pounding out of your chest. Multiply that by 100, throw in zero gravity, and take away your safety net. That's what astronauts deal with. They look calm on TV, smiling, waving, doing experiments with floating water droplets. But behind the scenes, there have been times when fear grabbed them by the throat, and they weren't sure if they'd make it back alive. And here's the thing. I think that's what makes these stories so fascinating. Because when we talk about astronauts, we tend to imagine superheroes. People who have no fear, who are perfect, who just float around in space like it's another day at the office. But the truth, they're human, just like us. They get scared, they make mistakes, and sometimes they find themselves in situations so dangerous, you'll wonder how they ever survived. And that's why I wanted to bring you these stories today, because not only are they thrilling, they also remind us of something deeply personal. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's what you do when fear is staring you right in the face. So let's start with one of the most famous, oh no moments in space history, the Gemini 8 mission. This was way back in 1966, when astronauts Neil Armstrong and David Scott were testing docking procedures in orbit. Everything was going smoothly. They docked their spacecraft with an unmanned target vehicle. High fives all around, right? But then, without warning, the spacecraft started spinning. Not just a little spin, like when you twirl in your office chair. No, this was violent, uncontrollable tumbling. Imagine being strapped into a roller coaster that never ends, with your vision blurring, your stomach churning, and your body being pulled in every direction. The spin was so intense that if it didn't stop, they would have blacked out. And in space, blacking out doesn't end well. Neil Armstrong had to make a split-second decision. He undocked the spacecraft and used the re-entry thrusters, the ones meant for coming back to Earth, not for mid-space maneuvers, to stop the spin. It worked, but it also meant the mission had to be aborted. Can you imagine that? Sitting there, knowing the ship you're in is one wrong move away from killing you. And the only way out is to use the tools in a way they were never designed for. That's courage. That's quick thinking under pressure. And Armstrong, well, you already know what kind of history he went on to make just a few years later on the moon. But that's just the beginning, because space is unpredictable, and sometimes the danger comes when you least expect it, like during a spacewalk. You've seen those breathtaking images of astronauts floating outside the International Space Station, tethered by a thin line, the Earth spinning slowly below them. Looks peaceful, right? But imagine this. What if that line snapped? What if your lifeline to the station suddenly broke and you started drifting away, completely untethered, with no way to stop yourself? That's the nightmare every astronaut has tucked in the back of their mind. And it almost happened. In 2013, Italian astronaut Luca Parmitano went outside the station for a routine spacewalk. Everything was fine at first, but then he started to feel something strange inside his helmet. At first, he thought it was sweat, but the liquid kept growing. It wasn't sweat, it was water. His helmet was filling up with water, and in zero gravity, water doesn't drip down, it floats and sticks. The liquid started covering his nose, his eyes, his mouth. He could barely breathe. Imagine being trapped inside a fishbowl that's filling up with water, except you're in space, and you can't just rip the helmet off. Parmitano said he couldn't hear, he couldn't talk, and he could barely see where he was going, blind, half drowning, and floating in the blackness of space. That might be one of the most terrifying situations a human can ever experience. Thankfully, his crewmates helped guide him back to the airlock, and he survived. But think about that for a second. This was a highly trained astronaut, wearing one of the most advanced suits ever made, and still, he almost drowned in space. That story alone is enough to keep me awake at night, and it makes you wonder, how many other close calls have we never even heard about? Now, I don't know about you, but when I hear stories like that, my first reaction is pure amazement. But then another thought creeps in. Why do they do it? Why do astronauts put themselves through these risks? It's not like they don't know how dangerous it is. They know better than anyone. And yet, they still climb into those rockets, strap themselves into what is basically a giant controlled explosion, and blast off into the unknown. Is it bravery, curiosity, a little bit of both? And here's where it gets interesting, because the scariest moments aren't always about equipment failures or malfunctions. Sometimes, the real fear comes from the unknown, things you can't prepare for, because no one has ever experienced them before, like the eerie sounds astronauts report hearing when they're in space. Knocks, whistles, even what some have described as ghostly music. NASA usually has logical explanations, like the spacecraft's metal contracting, or signals bouncing around. But still, imagine being alone on the far side of the moon, completely cut off from Earth, and hearing strange sounds in the darkness. Tell me that wouldn't give you chills. And speaking of chills, we're just scratching the surface here. We've talked about spinning out of control, drowning in a space helmet, and hearing mysterious noises. But wait until you hear about the time astronauts saw flames inside their spacecraft, or the moment one astronaut realized his glove was punctured during a spacewalk, with nothing but thin fabric between his skin and the vacuum of space. Oh yeah, it gets scarier, and that's where we're heading next. So stick with me, because part 2 is going to dive into even more jaw-dropping stories of survival, fear, and quick thinking. If you thought drowning in a helmet was terrifying, just wait until you hear what else has happened up there. So where were we? Right, terrifying moments in space. And I promised you, things were about to get even scarier. Let's talk about fire, because if there's one thing astronauts fear more than almost anything else, it's flames inside a spacecraft. On Earth, fire is bad enough, but at least you can run, you can grab an extinguisher, you can call for help. In space, there's nowhere to run. The air you breathe is the fuel, and you're trapped in what is basically a sealed metal can. One of the most chilling examples happened on the Russian space station Mir in 1997. Picture this: 6 astronauts floating peacefully, going about their day, when suddenly, boom, a fire breaks out. Not just a flicker, but a raging torch-like flame shooting from a faulty oxygen generator. And the fire wasn't vertical, like we know it on Earth. In zero gravity, flames behave differently. They form a kind of ball, a hungry sphere of fire that spreads unpredictably. Smoke filled the cabin. Alarms blared. For a full 14 minutes, they fought to put it out. 14 minutes might not sound long, but imagine being locked in a burning airplane, with nowhere to go, no emergency exit, and no one coming to save you. Astronaut Jerry Lininger, who was on board, later said he thought he was about to die. Think about how terrifying that must be. Watching fire dance through the very air you need to stay alive. Knowing if it wins, there's nothing you can do. But somehow, they managed to smother it, and the crew survived. Still, to this day, astronauts say fire is one of the things they train hardest for. Because it's the nightmare you hope never becomes real. But fire isn't the only invisible threat. Imagine being outside the station on a spacewalk. Everything going smoothly, when suddenly your glove gets punctured. Now, gloves are designed to handle the extreme environment, but they're not indestructible. In 2007, astronaut Rick Mastracchio experienced just that. He noticed a tear on the outer layer of his glove during a spacewalk. At first glance, it might not sound too bad. After all, it was just the outer layer, right? But remember, outside Earth's atmosphere, you're exposed to the deadly vacuum of space. Even the smallest puncture could mean rapid depressurization. Essentially, your suit becomes useless. And your body? Well, it's not designed to survive in space without protection. Luckily, the damage didn't breach the inner layers. But NASA wasn't about to take chances. They immediately cut the spacewalk short. Imagine being in his position, looking down at Earth, realizing a small rip in your glove could literally be the difference between life and death. How do you stay calm in that moment? And here's the crazy part. Astronauts know things like this can happen, and yet they still go out there. Why? Because the work they do is vital. Every bolt they tighten, every panel they fix, it all adds up to keeping the mission alive. It's like being a mechanic working on a car. Except the car is the size of a football field. It's moving at 17,500 miles per hour. And if you make a mistake, you don't just lose a car, you lose your life. But sometimes, the scariest moments aren't about mechanical failures. They're about the human body itself. Space is brutal on the human body. No gravity means your muscles shrink, your bones weaken, and your fluids shift in strange ways. But one of the most shocking moments came when astronaut Scott Parazynski was out on a spacewalk in 2007. He was repairing a torn solar panel, basically working near live wires, carrying huge amounts of electricity. One wrong move, and he could have been electrocuted instantly. As he stretched his body to make the repair, the panel was so delicate that even a tiny mistake could have shredded it further or shocked him. Everyone back at Mission Control was holding their breath. They said it was one of the most dangerous spacewalks ever attempted. And yet, he did it successfully. Can you imagine the pressure? One slip, and you're gone. But let me throw another terrifying scenario at you. Space debris. Right now, Earth's orbit is like a cosmic junkyard. Thousands of pieces of old satellites, rocket fragments, and random debris are whizzing around at insane speeds, sometimes faster than a bullet. Even a small bolt, just an inch long, could puncture the International Space Station if it hit at the wrong angle, and the astronauts know this. In fact, there have been multiple times when the crew was forced to climb into their escape capsules because debris was on a collision course with the station. Imagine sitting in that capsule, waiting to see if a piece of space junk slams into your home, knowing you might have to abandon it forever. That's not just scary, it's surreal. The idea that something as small as a screw could be your biggest threat out there. And since we're on the topic of surreal, let's talk about the psychological side of space. Astronauts often describe how strange and unsettling it feels to realize how isolated you are. There's no phone call home, no quick trip back if something goes wrong. On missions like Apollo, when they went around the far side of the moon. There were moments when they were completely cut off from Earth. No communication, no reassurance, just silence. Imagine being on the far side of another world, knowing no one can hear you, knowing if something goes wrong, you're utterly alone. That kind of isolation can play tricks on your mind. And it's not just the silence. There are also the strange sounds. Like I mentioned earlier, knocks, beeps, whistles. Things astronauts can't always explain. Sure, most have logical causes. But when you're already stressed and your life is on the line, even the smallest unexplained sound can send a chill down your spine. And speaking of chills, there's one more story I want to share in this section. And it might just be the one that gives me goosebumps every time. In 1971, the Soviet Soyuz 11 mission ended in absolute tragedy. The 3 cosmonauts aboard, Dobrovolsky, Volkov, and Patsayev, had successfully spent over 3 weeks in space, setting a record at the time. But during re-entry, a cabin vent valve malfunctioned. The spacecraft depressurized, and within minutes, all 3 men were gone. When rescuers opened the capsule after landing, they found them lifeless in their seats. It's the only instance in history where humans have died in space itself, not during launch or landing, and it's a sobering reminder of just how unforgiving that environment really is. Even today, astronauts think about that. They know the risks, and yet they still go. That level of courage is almost hard to wrap your head around. Now, I don't know about you, but as I hear these stories, I can't help but think about how fragile human life really is. We walk around on Earth every day with gravity holding us down, air filling our lungs, and safety nets everywhere we look. But out there, every second is borrowed time. And that's what makes these stories so powerful. They're not just tales of fear. They're stories of survival, of bravery, and of pushing past the limits of what most of us could ever imagine doing. But here's the thing. We're not done yet, because the scariest stories, the ones that really stick with you, aren't just about mechanical failures, fires, or depressurization. They're about the deeply human side of space travel, the emotions, the moments of pure vulnerability, and the times when astronauts looked into the abyss of space and had to confront what it really means to be human. That's what we're diving into next. So buckle up, because part 3 is going to take you deeper into the most emotional, inspiring, and unforgettable stories of astronauts facing fear in space. And I promise, it's going to leave you thinking about life in a whole new way. So here we are. We've already talked about fires in space, ripped gloves, spinning spacecraft, drowning helmets, and even tragic losses. You'd think that would cover it all, right? But the truth is, the scariest moments astronauts experience aren't always the ones you can see. Sometimes, they're the quiet moments, the moments when the weight of where they are and how fragile life really is hits them like a tidal wave. Imagine floating near a window on the International Space Station. You're looking down at Earth, and it's breathtaking. You can see entire continents pass beneath you in minutes. Sunrises and sunsets sweep across the planet 16 times a day. It's beautiful, almost peaceful, but then you glance the other way, out into the blackness. It's not just dark, it's infinite. No stars twinkling like in the movies. No comforting glow. Just an endless void that feels like it could swallow you whole. Many astronauts have admitted that this view is both awe-inspiring and deeply unsettling, because in that moment, you realize just how small you are, how alone you are, how fragile everything is, and that feeling of fragility has hit astronauts in very real, very scary ways. Take the story of Apollo 13. We all know the famous line, "Houston, We've had a problem. But what really happened was one of the most terrifying moments in human spaceflight. An oxygen tank exploded, crippling their spacecraft. Power dropped. Systems shut down. The temperature started falling. Suddenly, 3 men were 200,000 miles from home, with a crippled ship and almost no chance of survival. And yet, they made it back. Why? Because they refused to give up. Mission Control refused to give up. They worked together, problem after problem, improvising with duct tape, plastic bags, and sheer determination. Apollo 13 has been called a successful failure, but to me, it's one of the most inspiring stories ever told. Out of fear came ingenuity. Out of danger came teamwork. And out of what could have been tragedy came one of NASA's greatest triumphs. And here's the part that sticks with me. When those astronauts looked out the window, they could see Earth in the distance, a tiny glowing marble against the black. That was home. That was everything. Their families, their friends, every memory they ever had, all floating on that little blue dot. Can you imagine how desperately they must have wanted to get back, and how terrifying it must have been to wonder if they ever would? That same feeling comes up in stories from astronauts today. Chris Hadfield, for example, once talked about the importance of preparation in handling fear. He said that astronauts don't get rid of fear. They practice over and over until they know exactly what to do when the worst happens. But even he admitted that when you're in your suit, strapped to a rocket that's basically millions of pounds of controlled explosives, it's impossible not to feel that rush of fear. The difference is, they learn to work with it instead of letting it paralyze them. And maybe that's the deeper lesson hidden in all these scary moments. Fear is universal. We all feel it. Maybe not in a space capsule spinning out of control, but in our own lives. Whether it's speaking in front of a crowd, starting something new, or facing personal struggles we're not sure we can handle. Fear is always there, but astronauts teach us something powerful. It's not about being fearless. It's about choosing courage. It's about saying, yes, I'm terrified, but I'm gonna take the next step anyway. Let me share one last story that perfectly captures this. In 1965, during the Gemini 4 mission, astronaut Ed White became the first American to perform a spacewalk. He floated out into the void, tethered only by a thin cord, with nothing but the Earth below him and infinity above. And do you know what he said when it was time to come back inside? He didn't want to. Despite the fear, despite the risk, he described it as the most exhilarating moment of his life. He said he felt like he was touching the face of God. That right there, that mix of fear and wonder, is what space is all about. And here's the thing, you don't need to be an astronaut to understand that feeling. Every single one of us has moments where fear and wonder collide. Think about the first time you did something you weren't sure you could do. Maybe it was standing up for yourself, or moving to a new place, or starting a dream project. Your heart was racing, your palms were sweating, and part of you wanted to back out. But you did it anyway. And when you came out the other side, you realized something. You were stronger than you thought. That's exactly what these scary astronaut stories show us. Yes, space is terrifying. Yes, it's dangerous. But it's also where humans prove, again and again, that we're capable of so much more than we believe. We face the unknown, and we push through. And that's not just a story about space. It's a story about all of us. So the next time you're scared, remember Luca Parmitano, nearly drowning in his helmet and still finding his way back. Remember Neil Armstrong, spinning uncontrollably and choosing the one bold move that saved his life. Remember Apollo 13 and how duct tape, teamwork, and human grit brought 3 men safely home. Fear will always be there, but so will courage. And if those astronauts can face the vacuum of space, then you can face whatever challenge is in front of you right now. Thank you for spending this time with me today, diving into these incredible stories of fear and survival in space. If you felt inspired, or if any of these moments gave you chills, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. Which story stuck with you the most? And if you enjoyed this journey, go ahead and give this video a like. It really helps the channel grow. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss our next deep dive into the mysteries of space. Because trust me, there are so many more stories to tell. And if you know someone who's been facing their own fears lately, maybe share this video with them. Because astronauts prove one simple truth. Fear is real, but so is courage. Until next time, keep looking up, keep dreaming big, and remember, you're braver than you think.